Welcome to Created Healthy. I'm Dawn Combs. It's a common idea that God gave us everything we need in nature, but do we believe it enough to walk that out in truth? Often the very same people who say this go looking for answers on how to use food and medicine from man-made sources. Everything man creates comes with a user's manual. Why would God be any different? I challenge you to join me in seeking revelation about our body, mind, soul, and spirit health by digging into His written word and in practicing pure science in the visible world of His creation. Do you believe that weeds are evil and a curse, or that they are part of God's creation? The answer is pretty important in how our health is as a society today. I think you may be surprised to find that your answer is dictated a lot by how maybe we have misunderstood some of what is said in the Bible. And it's the thread that I want to pick at today in Matthew 12 through 15. Jesus is continuing his ministry, and he's walking with the disciples at this point from town to town. And we find him actually walking through a wheat field to begin with. And I think that's kind of important because the back and forth that happens over these 4 chapters between him and the Pharisees, I think Jesus takes the moments that he's actually living and uses them as a recognizable metaphor for what he's trying to teach. So the Pharisees, as just a refresher, the Pharisees are a group of, they're kind of middle-class Jews. They believe in works over sacrifice. They are more concerned with outward piety, the show of faith, the practice of ritual. And they're relatively, as a group, low on faith. They're converting Gentiles, and they believe that they can convert Gentiles to their way, but it is truthfully just their belief that the more they practice ritual, the more, if they follow tradition and sort of man-made dogma, they can actually usurp and rewrite God's original commandments. And Jesus calls them out throughout this. There are a few times where there are interactions between the disciples and Jesus and the Pharisees where they are questioning their practices. And especially in 15, they question why the disciples don't wash their hands, because this is a sticking point for them. The washing of the hands means that you're following the dogma. If you follow the ritual, then you can be saved. And only people that wash their hands, very literally, will enter God's kingdom. And Jesus uses a lot of parables here to talk about God's kingdom. And so we see some of the famous ones, the sower of seeds, where the example is of someone who is dropping seeds by the wayside in rocky places with very little soil, among the thorns and on good soil. He brings up Isaiah here and says that reiterates what Isaiah said, that there will be people who can hear but not understand, see but have no perception. Their hearts will be dulled, their ears can't hear, and their eyes are closed on purpose. Seeing and understanding is a blessing. He talks about the parable of the tares among the wheat, which is actually a specific plant. That plant is actually called darnel or Lolium timolentum. And I want to come back to that. He talks about the kingdom of heaven as a mustard seed, as leaven, as hidden treasure that you would find on a piece of land and then sell everything else that you own to acquire that piece of land. as a costly pearl that you might find and buy with everything else that you sold, and a dragnet. Here, talking about the idea that in a dragnet, as a fisher, the angels can pick what is good of the fish and toss away the bad. There's a lot here that he's talking about selecting. The idea that there is a harvest and that some things are good enough and worthy enough to keep and some things are cast away or burnt. With the Pharisees, when he has the interaction about not washing hands, he points out that the Pharisees they're cold-hearted. They're not seeking God's heart. They're not putting that relationship with God in their heart space. They are hollow. They are only doing acts, and in the acts of tradition and practice, traditions, they're showing their hypocrisy. So they throw out the commandment of honor thy father and thy mother. And he brings up Isaiah again here, that these people honor with their lips, but their heart is far from me. This is Isaiah talking about God's perception. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of man. So there's a lot of emphasis here again on our heart space, on our heart and our intentions being the most important part of our faith and our relationship with God. Finally, in this reading, we come to the Canaanite woman who is not part of the tribe of Israel. She is not a descendant. She is not a birthright Christian. She's not somebody that is already guaranteed, quote unquote, the kingdom of heaven. And she is crying to Jesus, and the disciples actually are kind of annoyed with her. And I think they cheer on Jesus when he says to the woman, it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Because this is something that they've been taught. Those people who are not in the tribe of Israel do not deserve this information, do not deserve the healing, do not deserve a relationship with God. They're not created for that. They're other. They're not as good. And Jesus says this in their hearing, and I think they're already annoyed by her. They cheer it on, I think. And when she responds, even the dogs feed on the crumbs which fall from their master's table. He is pleased with this. And I think this is an object lesson in front of his disciples, that this woman has the faith to see who Jesus is. Even though she hasn't been brought up in all of the tradition and all of the knowledge, she hasn't had it recited to her over and over and over again to look for him. She just knows him when she sees him without it. It is more born of a natural state within her than a teaching or a ritual. And he rewards her and answers her petition for healing for her daughter because of her faith. So we have these issues of having a real relationship with Christ, a real relationship with God, a proper heart space, not doing empty rituals, and seeing Christ for who he really is. And I want to go back to the tares among the wheat. This is a weed, again, Lolium timolentum, and it's considered a weed. And I think this is one of those passages that we have, as humans, taken human doctrine and framed it to understand what God is all about. And when we look at the Bible as a whole, when we look at Jesus' teachings, we really do need to look at what God has been telling us about himself. And so in creation, what God is telling us about himself, and then look at the Bible as a whole. So I want to take you all the way back to Genesis. I'm obviously a weed crusader, and I look at weeds in a different perspective than we are taught in cultural dogma, if you will. Our cultural dogma is that we have an enemy and we are fighting, and I do believe that that comes. It's being reinforced and supported in a way. It's using scripture. But I think that that's not what God is saying in his scripture. So in Genesis, God creates everything here on the earth. He creates everything and calls it good. So every plant that is created is good. So I think it's odd for us to get an interpretation from something like this parable where there are plants that the enemy has sown amongst the field that need to be pulled out, and we need to look at them as bad. And out of that, we've decided that there's this supportive scripture for us to think weeds are bad or a curse. But that is in direct dissonance with what God tells us at creation. Everything is created by God, and it is good. We know that the enemy cannot create. He can only imitate. So he didn't create weeds. God created things that we call weeds. So let's talk about what this plant really is. It is a plant that looks so like wheat that it can't really be, you can't tell the difference between it until it bears its fruit. And this is something that Jesus says over and over again. He's talking about looking at who bears fruit. So you can do a ritual all day long for your whole life. You can perform a ritual and you can do it without having the heart for God. And you can bear no fruit. And you will be this darnel. You will be this example of a plant that either provides no fruit or provides evil fruit. So the darnel it's a look-alike. You can't tell the difference until it bears fruit. It looks exactly like wheat in a field. And the way that it's dealt with in an agricultural society is that as the wheat is ready to harvest, it's then that you can tell the difference. So the darnel is a black seed where the wheat is a dark brown. Wheat bows its head when it is ripe, whereas the darnel stays rigidly straight. There is a different arrangement of how the grains are in the seed head, and that comes down to more, if you're a botanist, you start to look at some of those different technical aspects that you might not notice as a layman. But the color and the way that the heads bow are very obvious. We have been told forever that darnel is poisonous. And this is because it would get mixed in, because you can't tell the difference. It would grow in amongst the wheat, and the seeds would get mixed in with wheat and ground, and it actually causes intoxication. So there hasn't actually been, I have not found in any literature actually proven death from ingesting darnel. The plant is really fascinating, though. So if we think about it from a level of it's evil, in Jesus's parable, he uses the darnel because, as I said, we start this reading where Jesus and his disciples are walking through a wheat field. I think his mind was already on the region and thinking about ways that he could explain these hard concepts, these new concepts to them, that you can have plants growing side by side, and one of them comes under an influence that turns it into something that bears fruit that isn't good. And that individual needs to be harvested out separately and destroyed. And that is what he's giving all of these parables to show that the angels will sort the fish that are bad. The angels will sort the tares from the wheat. But he's not actually saying that darnel is evil. He's talking, it's a higher concept that he's using a metaphor that they will understand. Because in this region, the plant, darnel, comes up naturally amongst the wheat. It is something that wasn't planted, but that arises from the soil independently. And so Jesus says in this parable, imagine if you planted only wheat seeds and then somebody, your enemy, came along and specifically planted darnel. There were people that saved darnel seeds because guess what? It's actually useful. It has a long history of medicine. It has been used medicinally for a pain reliever. In some places, it was used as an anesthetic. It is anti-inflammatory. People have used it topically, and it has been used as a preventative for poisoning. And when it's young, before we allow the fruit to arise, you can cut it and it's really good feed for your animals. But the seed causes a problem, and a little bit of it causes intoxication. It is believed that heavy amounts of it will cause death. The other interesting aspect of darnel is that it has its compounds that are problematic in humans that causes the intoxication are actually anti-insect. And so if you can imagine the usefulness of this plant arising on its own out of the seed table here and there amongst a grain harvest that you actually want to have, if it's got natural insecticidal, insects are going to be killed off, and it's going to benefit the wheat crop because it's helping to prevent a locust attack or some other critter coming through and eating the wheat down when we want to harvest the fruit. So does that sound like something that is inherently evil? Does it sound like darnel is something that was created by Satan, which we know is impossible? We also know that God doesn't create things that are evil. He only creates things that are good. We know that from Genesis. So the darnel in itself, the weed, this word that we have crafted and that we have created an all-out war against, that actually has sacrificed our health to date, the darnel is actually a useful part of design. It is part of the design of protecting the wheat field. It is part of the design that signals that the soil is needing more organic matter because it thrives where the soil is losing fertility. It is a sign, it is something that can be used for medicine. There are uses for this plant because it was created and it is good and is part of the design. So God wasn't telling us in this parable that that evil is like a weed, or that evil is a weed that needs to be pulled out, and therefore we need to shepherd and steward the earth in the same way. He's telling this community in a language and an understanding that they have because they're agricultural and they have to deal with this plant, and it causes more work, and it's not as useful for what they're trying to do as the wheat. They're having to separate it. He's explaining the bigger concept here. The other thing to note that's interesting about darnel is that one of the compounds in it is called, let me look at my notes here, lowline. This is an alkaloid that we believe is causing the drunkenness and is causing the problem in humans and animals. And it only arises because of a symbiotic relationship with fungus in the soil. So the plant isn't inherently filled with something that's going to cause problems like we see in humans. It happens as an association. It becomes colonized by fungus, sending all of its mycorrhizae through, and it shares its matter with the plant. So the plant, in essence, and again, we aren't going to look at the fungus that does this as evil either, but we need to look at the principle. The plant becomes colonized by an external entity, and it changes it. It turns it into something that must be separated and cast aside. And the wheat, in turn, is not being colonized with that, and it's good. It's something that we gather into our barn. But the darnel we gather and we burn because we don't want that culture, that colonization to continue. Much like Satan doesn't create things. He doesn't create nature. He doesn't create humans. But he can imitate God. He can imitate God's knowledge and his parables and his teachings. He can imitate to corrupt and turn it evil. So the parable of the tare and the wheat is so complex here, but meant to be really simple. It was meant to be a metaphor that was understood really quickly, to understand that God will have to separate those that have been colonized by evil. They didn't start out that way. They were part of the design. They were created perfectly, but they were colonized in such a way that they had to be cast aside. And it's a warning, just like the leaven, that we cannot allow ourselves to be cultured by evil, because then we will be cast aside. We cannot allow God's teachings to be imitated and to infiltrate our culture in such a way that we learn something that we weren't supposed to learn, and we actually harm ourselves by dumping chemicals on the ground and killing off God's creation, and using a teaching like this to actually empower evil to fight against God and God's creation is truly evil. So what do you think? Are weeds evil, or are they created by God? I pray today and every day that God is blessing you, and that he gives you the curiosity to look deeper into his word and dig into the science that he's given us, the creation examples that he's given us to explore what his intentions are in both his word and his creation for our good. I hope I see you tomorrow. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share with a friend. And I'm always interested in hearing what God is laying on your heart. So drop me a rating or review, or join the conversation on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube at Dawn Combs Really.